trade misinvoicing has been identified in many studies as being one of the main types or channels for flows of illicit financial flows. To that end, we have included two of the methods in the guidelines. So the one we'll be looking into today, the partner country method, and the other one, price filter method. So those are the methods that have been applied in various cases using, to some degree, different data sources, and also being differently administered or processed in terms of getting to the results. In some of the studies, it has been shown that both methods, so partner country method and price filter method, even though they would be addressing or trying to measure the same type of tax and commercial illicit financial flows, they do produce different results, which can be anticipated to a certain level of degree, as, for example, partner country method may in its purest form have a higher probability of taking other factors into account, so other than the illicit financial flows. On the other hand, the price filter method is only focusing on a part of misinvoicing, so only on the mispricing. So it has a narrower scope for that matter. So it is important that to as much as possible, maybe we can apply both of the methods and then try and compare the results. But also what has been actually shown or even suggested is that the partner country method can be used as a first step, as a first method to somehow get a better picture of what essentially is going on. So try to identify some of the categories, flows, commodities, or specific partners, which may be more susceptible to the illicit financial flows. And then use the price filter method, which is a more detailed method to go into those specific areas and produce more accurate or more reliable estimates. Okay, so those are the two methods that we said we will be covering. So today we're looking at the partner country method. Now, there is a side note that I have to make here. Both of the methods have a little plus next to them, which is trying to indicate that certain adjustments or enhancements are proposed in their application as we move along. You may remember that for a statistical measurement, some additional aspects will have to be covered or included. Therefore, when we refer to the partner country method, we essentially not mean the partner country method that has been applied already in various researches, but to go to the most detailed or detailedly processed partner country method, therefore partner country method plus. So on the conceptual side, the partner country method is a top-down method, meaning that we start at the aggregate level analysis, and we're not looking at a particular unit's view, so we're not using microdata per se in this method. However, we do want to, even though we start at the aggregated level, and sometimes we also stay at that level, we still have to dig deeper in terms of the reasons for any potential asymmetries reported or obtained using this method. So the method is essentially building on the mirroring of trade statistics by partner countries. So essentially, it is looking what exports of country A to country B are and how those compare to declared imports of country B from country A. And then we are cross-checking those two records and observe whether there are any discrepancies in between. The major assumption behind the partner country method is that one of the partners' values are correct. So this means that, for example, country A's records of exports may not be correct, but country B's imports are correctly valued, and therefore any difference in country A's exports to country B's imports would be treated as misinvoicing or similar. So this is a very critical assumption, which is also highly unlikely in the real world, so to say. So that's why serious doubts have been raised about reliability of this method, and we will try and address some of those doubts to make this method, let's say, more applicable or reliable in terms of statistical measurement. Maybe a side note here, a few studies that have been done using partner country method have somehow, at least implicitly, implied that trade records of developed economies are more accurate than the ones of developing economies. So hence there was a lot of research that was titled, illicit financial flows from developing economies, and they were comparing developing to developed economies and so on. Now, of course, this has turned out to be not the case. We know that illicit financial flows, first of all, they cross borders, which means that many countries are involved. In today's globalized world, connected, super connected world, of course, illicit financial flows are flowing everywhere. Essentially, every country in the world is susceptible to illicit financial flows. And it is not only the developing economies or the developed economies, it is essentially all. And again, we can remember that the SDG indicator 1641 on illicit financial flows requires both inward and outward illicit financial flows. So if there are outward financial flows from developing economies, then there must be inward financial flows into developed economies, and vice versa, and also within the groups themselves. Of course, both flows, inward and outward, are important because they bring about various consequences to our societies, to our economies. So therefore, it is important to observe both flows, inward and outward flows. You may remember in the last days, some of the methods were only able to capture one type of flow. Usually those would be the outward IFFs. However, in the trade misinvoicing, we can essentially be looking at both inward and outward, and this is a extremely strong case for the application of such a method. Now, when we said that the assumption is to have that one value is correct, the other one is incorrect, we also need to know that this method is, of course, inheriting many limitations pertaining to a simple fact that many factors, not only illicit financial flows, contribute to trade asymmetries that are being observed in those bilateral data. So the most, or the three main or well-known factors for asymmetries in those bilateral trades would be, number one, application of criteria or different criteria for partner country attribution, referring to the imports, exports, but then also the categories of re-imports or re-exports. So those will be very important to see how they have to be applied in order to avoid any discrepancies caused in bilateral trade statistics. The second very well known and also research reason for asymmetries is the difference between CIF and FOB valuation. So the CIF, so cost insurance freight, so this is usually the how the import statistics are reported on, whereas on the other hand, FOB, free on board or freight on board, is usually how the export statistics are reported. And of course, they would have different valuations. So in order to, when we just simply observe exports reported and imports reported, normally we would have a difference that will be reflecting the CIF and FOB differences. This may not be always the case, but we have to check if it is. And if it is, we have to, of course, account for those. And the third very important element, or as a major factor of trade asymmetries, is the application of different trade systems. So we have the general or the special trade system, and in the special trade systems, there are of course many options. So we need to observe which trade systems are being used in partner countries before we can make any moves ahead. Now, of course, those exports of one country and the imports of other countries may not coincide, also due to other reasons like the time lags, or we have the misclassifications or goods passing, as we mentioned, through third countries or customs. There could be lack of information or misspecification. There could be statistical measurement errors and so on. So there are multiple factors that are essentially contributing, and we should be accounting for them as much as possible. So even with those major drawbacks of the method, of course, the method is not redundant, is not useless. Rather, let's try and find out ways how to overcome those limitations, to bring them on board, and essentially say, okay, we have a difference, we have a discrepancy in bilateral trade statistics. So now let's try and understand what are the reasons behind it, and take out all the reasons which can be explained by various reasons for that, as we've seen before. So the valuation, the trade systems, the time lags, and so on. And what we're left with, we cannot explain. So we can reasonably well consider this part as illicit financial flows. Now, most of the applications of the method, of the partner country method, have been done using globally accessible data on bilateral trade flows, such as the UNCTAD or IMF DOTS databases. And of course, this is a perfectly well-suited solution or data source to observe what is going on at the aggregated and international levels. However, it may be missing, or it is missing, a lot of detailed information that are required for this method to be truly reliable. National statistical authorities, and we believe in particular the customs authorities, have more detailed data. And more of all, they have also relevant expertise and knowledge that needs to be brought into the game, again, as with other methods, in all stages of the application of the method. So first, to see which data to use, whether they make sense, so validating our inputs into the calculation phase or into this method, but then also interpreting results and providing guidance in what essentially results would mean, would they make sense, validating them, and so on. So in the guidelines, we do propose that the partner country method can be used, but somewhat enhanced to address those limitations. So therefore, we have this PCM plus noted. So the first proposal is to compare national data with trading partners or with major trading partners. So we believe that, when we actually have national data, so nationally available data, they could be more detailed, and they would actually be more suitable, and they would more accurately lay out the picture of our country's exports or imports, and vice versa, carrying out mirror exercises with our partners or major trading partners. We can essentially observe and identify those discrepancies at the more granular level and using more accurate data. Of course, in an ideal scenario, we would be comparing our national data bilaterally with all the countries. This may not in practice be fully available. So we may focus on our major trading partners and say like the top 5 or top 10, or let's say accounting for 75% of our trade, and we can try and see. Now, this of course may work or maybe more easily obtained if we are a big trading partner for all the other countries. If on the other hand, we're a small economy, and of course we only play a tiny portion in all of our major trading partners, there may be some delays, if not reluctancy, of our major trading partners to report back to us or review bilateral trade statistics. Nevertheless, as much as possible, using nationally available data is a suggestion to be going with. So this we touch upon the second point, which is to use granular national data. So including most detailed levels of the production classification by partner, and all potentially available microdata, by which we could reduce any uncertainties about the source of those bilateral trade asymmetries. So we mentioned earlier, so statistics usually held by customs authorities or anybody else within a national statistical system, and applying our method on those data would be improving the accuracy of our estimates. Again, it may not be fully viable to access and process all the data, so we may focus on only prominent flows or products or trading partners. So we have to be somewhat flexible and practical in the application of those suggestions. The third one, of course, addresses the CIF-FOB differences. We have to resolve them. So in some cases, so we mentioned exports, apologies. So exports are reported on a FOB valuation, whereas imports usually on a CIF valuation. Now, more and more countries are also reporting imports on FOB valuation. So we, of course, have to make sure if it is already FOB, then we just simply compare imports and exports, and they should be the same numbers. But in some cases, of course, this does not happen. So in those cases, we have to apply certain ratios, so the CIF-FOB ratios, to correct for those asymmetries that are caused by those differences in valuation. Whenever possible, and in a lot of cases, actually, it is possible, it is advisable to apply specific ratios for regions or even countries or commodities. So those would be more tailored to specific flows and may reflect better the differences in the valuation. In the global research that was done, so let's say a few years ago, it was a standard, I believe, to use a 10% CIF-FOB margin. Then in the last GFI report, I think they used a 6% valuation. But then there were also other studies by the World Customs Organization and some other researchers saying that we could be using different regional ones. I think there was a case in the WCO study about the US trade, and essentially trade with Europe, so US to Europe, the CIF margin was 2.2%. For South America, it was nearly 5%. And all other partners in the world, it was less than 3%. There was also a case study by the US, checking the trade between the US, China, and Hong Kong, and they realized that the eastbound and the westbound trade have different values of the CIF-FOB ratio. So it's not only the regional one, sometimes it is also the direction of the trade that might be causing any differences in the applications. Moreover, and specifically for commodities, it is actually true that different commodities may have different CFOB margins, so the percentage of their value. For high value goods such as I don't know, gold, it is actually shown that the CIF percentage or the CIF ratio in the value is much lower than for other goods. For some fresh goods or agricultural products, the transport costs are also usually higher than for other manufactured goods. So all of those things have to be taken into account when we are addressing the CIF differences. So the next one is addressing, it's very easy to write it down or read it. It says analyze remaining bilateral asymmetries, as if this was so simple. Of course, it is not. So there are many other reasons that we might be looking into and trying to account for when we look at the bilateral trade asymmetries. So we will be taking a look later on. There is a nice tool or a table that would guide us somehow in how or which asymmetries we could be using in order to address those differences. So this case or this table has been prepared by United Nations Statistics Division, and we will be focusing on relying on those tools, so to speak, or those guidance. The next point is applying reliability weighting procedure. In some cases where gaps in mirror trade statistics are very high or very substantial, these may raise some doubts about whether those are really a result of trade asymmetry or of illicit financial flows, or maybe they are a result of an error or something. There could be an additional zero typed in the data or something. So to somehow account for this, to address that doubts that those larger gaps may not be essentially as a result of misinvoicing, the weighting procedure is applied to reduce the weight or the importance of those large asymmetries in our data when we are calculating it. We'll be looking into this procedure afterwards, it has been applied in a few cases by WCO, but also by ECLAC. So it is essentially, I believe it does offer some good grounds for the application. Now, the last point is, going away from a purely quantitative or statistical approach. It uses the qualitative approach. So it says that we should be validating our results using expertise, national customs and trade experts, but also international ones. Consult with them and try and get the sense whether the results are okay, whether there should be any adjustments or corrections for a particular flow or for a particular commodity. So this, I think, is very important to somehow validate the results and to increase the accuracy or reliability of the partner country method application. In order to apply partner country method, we require bilateral trade statistics. So between reporting country, which is our country, and our trading partners. So ideally, all of the trading partners, in a more limited way, only major trading partners. In some cases, when it is not possible to obtain any other data, we could also use the rest of the world category, so exports and imports to the rest of the world. However, as mentioned earlier, whenever we use nationally available and collected data, this would not be the case. We would always know who our trading partners are. So it is important that we have the analysis done at the level of trading partners as well. So the trade data that we would be looking at are, of course, the values and the volumes and the quantities of imports and exports. So the type of flows are imports and exports, but also we should be having data on the flows of re-imports and re-exports. We also need to get as much as possible data on the CIF and the FOB valuation, on all our trading partners, countries of origins and destinations, and similar. So ideally, we said those data would be collected nationally, usually by the customs authorities, but this may differ from country to country, where they would be collected, stored, and how they could be accessed and shared. And in an ideal scenario for a statistical measurement and the application of this method, we should be looking at the granular level data. So we would say at least 6 digits of the HS classification, and ideally we could also be adding some lower levels if those could be attained in our international trade. There are some international sources which could complement or supplement our national sources. So for the bilateral trade statistics, we have the UNCTAD and the IMF dots, so direction of trade statistics. So those are very valuable additional sources. And then we also have UNCTAD's global transport cost database. Those could be useful to be addressing the CIF-FOB valuation. And similarly, the OECD's ITIC, International Transport and Insurance Cost database, I believe. So those two databases would be very valuable in addressing the CIF and FOB valuations. A lot of the work is essentially in getting the data, in cleaning the data, and preparing the data for the application itself. So once we are past that phase, once we have the data prepared, we can move on to the calculation phase. So we are essentially following a procedure in several steps and slowly addressing one asymmetry reason after another. This flow chart here, prepared by the UNSD, so United Nations Statistics Division, is essentially leading us in that work. So first of all, when you observe the trade asymmetry, then check what are the differences in the trade systems, or whether there are differences in trade systems. Then check and address differences in valuation, so the CIF-FOB. Then check the partner country attributions, so make sure that you are addressing the questions of re-exports, consignments, sometimes also merchanting, and so on. And then check for other asymmetries, timing, under coverage, misclassification, and so on. And when you account for all of this, then you're left with the unexplained discrepancy, which could be attributed by assumption in this method and all the processes to illicit financial flows, so trade misinvoicing. It would be actually useful to start by assessing the published asymmetries, starting at the very aggregated level. You could start with total exports and imports, and then slowly move to selected commodity groups, and observing also what is going on with the major trading partners. And when you identify that there are some differences or discrepancies, you can go and dig deeper to a more detailed level in this first preliminary analysis. And even though you can do that, it is, of course, ideally you would be checking all the flows, all the partners, all the commodities with all the nationally available data. And in the cases where you can identify that there are obvious problems with the symmetries and validate the results, then the next step ideally would be to use price filter method. So the one method we will be looking into on Monday, and applies this method to those specific cases to provide even more detailed analysis and results. So first we have to check what is going on with the trade system. So we know that sometimes the trade systems, so the differences in the trade systems between countries may cause or may lead to trade asymmetries, but those asymmetries cannot be attributed to the illicit financial flows. So when we analyze the trade system, of course, first we have to identify or know what a statistical territory of a country is. So a statistical territory of a country is a territory with respect to which trade data are being compiled. So we have, our mainland, let's say, or our country, but then sometimes we might have islands, territorial waters, we could have industrial free zones, we could have enclaves, and so on. When statistical territory is the same as economic territory, then we say we have a general trade system. So this is the case here in the slide. So we have a economic territory, this square that includes the free circulation area, industrial free zones, premises for inward processing, commercial free zones, and custom warehouses. So all of this is economic territory, and all of this is also a statistical territory. So everything, and when I say everything, I mean by all, the goods, also services if possible, entering or leaving any of those are treated as imports and exports. So if anything comes from outside our economic territory into either free circulation area or custom warehouses or commercial free zones and so on is treated as imports. And anything that is leaving those 5 areas within an economic territory to the rest of the world is considered as exports. Now, what happens if statistical territory is not the same as economic territory? So in this case, we have a special trade system. So we can see, for example, that only industrial free zones, premises for inward processing, and free circulation area are included in a statistical statistical territory, which means that everything that is entering those 3 areas from anywhere else, either rest of the world, but also from commercial free zones and custom warehouses, is treated as imports. Anything that is leaving those areas is treated as exports by our country, that is. Now, if another country is exporting to our country and those exports go to the commercial free zone, they would be assigning this to their exports to our country, whereas we would be assigning this not as imports to our country, but imports to the commercial free zone. So in these cases, we see that it is a different treatment of those trade flows, sometimes treated as exports to our country by our partner countries, but they're not treated as imports to our country by our country, which means that there will be discrepancies arising from these trade flows, but they would be a result of the application of different trade systems and not because of the illicit financial flows. To that end, so whenever we have different applications of trade systems, so one country has a general trade system, the other one has a special trade system, or if both countries may be having special trade systems, but they would be comprising different categories or those entities, it is important to find out and adjust for those differences to enable that the flows that are actually being recorded and compared are the ones that are addressing the same flow, so entering various zones or areas in a country. Now, it is recommended that, of course, countries try and introduce the general trade system or apply it to their international trade statistics. Sometimes this is available, but in a few cases, of course, this may not be the case. Of course, trying to adjust for various parts of the economic territory that would not be captured in the special trade system and to encompass for the general trade system may be very resource intensive. So it is nevertheless still important to try and address those specific areas that are taken out of the specific trade systems to account for them and make sure that the trade statistics that are being used are essentially comparable. The next step, so the second step that we are going to address in obtaining, let's say, a clear measure of illicit financial flows using the trade asymmetries is to review the differences in valuation. So imports and exports are differently valued. Usually, the imports would be using the CIF valuation and the exports would be using the FOB, and those differences need to be accounted for. In some cases, countries are also reporting their imports in the FOB valuation. So if this is the case, then the correct measure is to apply the imports in FOB valuation and compare them to the corresponding export flows. Therefore, the differences would not be resulting due to differences in valuations. Now, this, however, is usually not the case. So we do have CIF and FOB valuations of imports and exports, respectively, and therefore we need to find a way how to account for those things. There are various ways to estimate the FOB valuation of imports. You know, we could look at the merchandise trade statistics, or we could use the insurance premiums and the freights of the importers and so on. But in most cases, what has been applied is a so-called CIF-FOB ratio, which is essentially a ratio between the imports in CIF and the exports in FOB. So trying to provide us a measure for a specific commodity or flows where those CIF-FOB ratios should be applied and how much they account for or amount to. CIF-FOB ratios would be ideally, and given the data availability, be constructed with respect to specific commodities or partners, so reporting or partner countries, and even years or regions sometimes. We discussed this already previously, so it is important to try and be as specific to a particular flow and commodity to essentially capture the CIF-FOB valuation, so the ratio or the differences in the best possible way. Various databases could be used for that. There is the UNCTAD Global Transport Cost Database, which may be useful here, and the OECD ITIC, so the transport and insurance cost database that we mentioned earlier. There is a case study in the guidelines by Carlotta Schuster and Junior Davis when they use the so-called mirror trade gap method, and they apply the CIF-FOB ratios for specific commodities using the OECD database. Now, the next step, of course, is to observe the partner country attribution. So what this means, in an international trade, goods can either be shipped to an importing country directly from the exporting country. However, in most of the cases in today's globalized world, the goods are entering or being shipped from one country to another through third country or third countries, through various countries. So in those cases, some of the asymmetries could be essentially resulting from that the country of exports may not know what the final destination of their products would be. And on the other hand, the importing country would not really know where the goods originated from. So for the flows of imports, there are two categories of partner countries that are important. So one is the country of origin. So this is essentially where the goods have originated, and they have been sent through various countries to, in the end, reach our country. The other one is a so-called country of consignment, which is sometimes also called the country of exports. So this is the country where we directly imported the goods from, but the goods may not be originating from that country. On the export side, we have again a category that is usually required to observe these flows, which is the country of final destination. Well, we see here that it is a final known destination, because in many cases, when the countries are exporting goods from country A to country B, they do not know that those goods may essentially end up in countries C, D, or F. Re-export flows are, of course, an important element in marking the exports of a particular country. So the re-exports would mean if in country B, we would be importing from country A and then exporting those things to country C. So our flow from country B to country C should essentially be a re-export flow, because we are not the country of origin, we are merely a country of exports. So those elements are important to identify in bilateral trade flows to ensure that the discrepancies in flows would not be resulting from them. So therefore, we would be more safe to assume that discrepancies would be resulting from from illicit trade, so to say. So here we have a very brief case study that is also explained in the guidelines, which helps us to understand this partner country or country assignments, to see essentially how things should be included. So this case is referring to a trade of mobile phones between China as a country of origin and the exporting country and Canada. If we take a look at the first row, so these are the official data, we see that Canadian imports amount to 3,329. So these are the million US dollars, I believe. So we have 3.3 imports of Canada, whereas the Chinese exports, so the corresponding exports, are only amounting to 1.4, which means that the published asymmetry is nearly 2,000. Now, why is there such a huge asymmetry? Well, if we do some of the adjustments for the partner country attribution, what we can see is that the Canadian imports of these Chinese mobile phones from countries other than China, so from countries of consignment, are amounting to 1,280. So the adjusted official data of Canadian imports of mobile phones directly from China is just above 2,000. And the remaining asymmetry, therefore, is shrink down to less than 700. So what is essentially going on here in the back? So the Chinese are exporting mobile phones to, let's say, the US, and Canada is importing the Chinese phones from the US, and it is in the official data in the first row, this is altogether marked as an import from China. But in fact, it should have been marked as a country of consignment, so country of exports, is in between to account for those discrepancies. Of course, this is a very simple case. We only have 3 countries, so to speak. This chain could be and it is in many cases much longer. So it is a very hard task to identify those flows and to really identify what is the country of origin and what is the country of final destination to properly account for the imports and exports in bilateral flows. So after we have accounted for those things, so the trade system, the valuation, and partner country attribution, of course, there are several other remaining asymmetries there, which could influence our result in terms of assessing the value of the illicit financial flows. So we know that the trade asymmetries can also arise from, like, the time lags in the shipments or the seasonal trade cycles and so on. For example, in the seasonal trade cycle, we might have a higher trade at the end of the year. The time lags in shipments would refer to, for example, if good is being exported and the goods are leaving one country, let's say at the end of December, but it takes 2 months or a month to get to the country of import, it will be marked as an export from our country in December of this year, but it would be then marked as imports in the receiving country only in the January of next year. So there are those time lags that are causing the different reporting of imports and the exports, and those should be accounted for. So of course, the time lags would be depending, on the mode of transport. If something is being transported just across the border using, let's say, road transport or airplanes, so the time lag may be much less or very insignificant. However, if we do have the trade flows taking place on water, like on oceans, those time lags may be having a significant impact on the asymmetries that we are observing. Other things or other sources of discrepancies, we have mentioned the coverage issues, the misclassifications, the measurement errors, the undervaluations, and so on. So these are all valid reasons for asymmetries, and as much as possible, we are to include and involve national experts in the customs to address those, to try and identify them, and of course, remove them from our calculations for the illicit financial flows. In order to get from the original data, whether the official data on the imports and the exports, and to go through all various adjustments to reach the adjusted data and essentially come up with a so-called remaining asymmetry, we could have, we could really go step by step. Here is a tool that the UNSD has proposed, so essentially a table saying that, okay, our imports, so this is the reporter, this is our country, are being cross-checked against the partner country's exports. And we have to do the adjustments for the valuation, for the trade system. We mentioned indirect trade or the exports, sometimes merchanting, time lags, and any other adjustments that we might find relevant, or the ones that we could actually also measure. And in the end, we obtain the so-called adjusted imports and the adjusted exports. When we do the differences between those two, we have the remaining asymmetry on the inbound part, in this case, because we are looking at the imports of reporting country. Of course, in the same way, we are processing the exports of our country, so the R exports, and therefore we obtain a so-called outbound remaining asymmetries, which are, of course, important for the consideration of our calculation. Now, before we move ahead to the final calculation, we have mentioned that the so-called reliability weighting procedure should be applied. What we are essentially doing in this step is that we are looking at the trade gaps that have been observed, so those asymmetries. And in the cases where we have large trade gaps, there may be a higher doubt that they would be resulting from misinvoicing. So, if there's a very huge discrepancy, this could essentially be only a result of a error when inputting the data or something, and not really the misinvoicing. So therefore, we are trying to mitigate this risk of unproportionally accounting for those large discrepancies. And in order to do so, we do apply these weights, which are applied to records of the inbound floats. So using those weights, so we are essentially observing the difference between the imports and the exports that are being obtained. If this discrepancy is 0, then of course the weight is 1. if the discrepancy is huge, then this whole weight is much reduced. And the inbound and the outbound flows, so the inbound as imports and the outbound as exports, are therefore expressed using these formulas. So we are essentially applying the weighting procedure, so these weights, to the discrepancy between the adjusted imports and the adjusted exports, or vice versa for the outbound. And we, having accounted for all these discrepancies, we are now relatively safe to assume that those discrepancies would be referring to misinvoicing alone. So this weighting procedure has been applied in literature, in the World Customs Organization has applied it. It was also the ACLAC paper on trade misinvoicing. So you may be looking into some of those for additional guidance in this case. So now the final step is essentially to calculate the inward and the outward illicit financial flows. Now, if we look at the inward illicit financial flows first, unlike, let's say, a regular trade, when imports, so the countries is importing goods, would mean the outflows of money. When we discuss illicit financial flows, things become a little bit more complicated. Both imports and exports can cause illicit financial flows. This will depend, we will try and explain this using these formulas here, on whether we are discussing the over-invoicing or under-invoicing of each of the flows, so of exports or of imports. And both parts are essentially needed and relevant for the illicit financial flows. We can already here say that if we have the inward illicit financial flows and the outward illicit financial flows, it is important to distinguish those two because they may have different effects on our economy, societies, but also are relevant for policy formulation. Outward illicit financial flows simply mean, bluntly speaking, that these flows are leaving our country, so the resources are being drained, in a short. On the other hand, inward illicit financial flows mean that the flows are flowing into our country illicitly, which means undetected, which means that, first of all, let's say the revenue, the public revenue may be reduced, but also those illicit financial flows that are incoming into the country, so inward IFFs, may be used for financing terrorism or for fueling corruption, undermining our institutions, and so on. Therefore, both flows are important, and therefore we also need to make a distinction here. So on the inward illicit financial flows, we see that they are composed of two parts, so-called over-invoiced exports and under-invoiced imports. So the over-invoiced exports, what does that mean? So that means that we are exporting a good that has a value of 100, but we are over-invoicing it, which means that we are selling it abroad, so to say, for the value of $120, if I use the dollars case. So we are sending out $100 worth of goods, but we are receiving 120. And those 20 are being the part of the over invoicing. So these are flowing into the country. So officially we do not see them because they are for the goods, but in fact we know that the good is only worth 100 and the additional 20 is being illicitly brought into the country. On the other hand, of the under-invoiced imports is when we are importing a good, let's say again a value of 100, but we are only paying 70 for it, which means we are importing this good, we only paid 70 for it, but then we can sell it, let's say on the black market or somewhere else by the value of 100. So we are essentially inflowing this difference, this $30 apiece. So the inward illicit financial flows are a sum of over-invoiced exports and under-invoiced imports. Now, how do we determine over-invoiced exports? Well, you may remember earlier we had the outbound flows, and essentially whenever the outbound flow is a positive value, this is considered to be an over-invoiced export. And vice versa, whenever an inbound flow is negative, this is considered as under-invoiced imports. So using those formulas here, we see that essentially we can identify each of the inbound or the outbound flow as either under-invoiced imports or over-invoiced exports, and we simply sum them up. Please note that there is a -1 there because we do not want to have negative values of any of those flows, because we do not want them to cancel each other out. We want them to be fully on board and captured. For the outward illicit financial flows, of course, the story is similar, just the opposite. So the outward IFFs, so these are the illicit financial flows leaving the country. These are composed of under-invoiced exports and over-invoiced imports. So the under-invoiced exports would be, we have our good that is that has a true value of 100, and we send it abroad, but our invoice only says 80, which means that we will be receiving 80 into our country, but the 20 will be put on our, let's say, offshore bank account. So our country will not be seeing it. So this is the amount of money that will be leaving our country as IFFs. On the over-invoiced imports, the story is the opposite. So we are importing a good which has a value of 100, but we are essentially paying, as per the invoice, 130. So we're paying 30 more, and this 30 is being flown out of our country. So that's why this is the outward IFFs. The over-invoiced import is being calculated as a positive value of inbound flows, and the under-invoiced exports as a negative value of the outbound flows. Please again note there is a -1 there to ensure that all the values that we are operating here with are positive values, so that nothing gets canceled out. And with this, we stop with method number 1 on the partner country method, and with the adjustments that are needed to obtain illicit financial flows. There will be more cases and additional explanations in the guidelines, but also when we discuss it with the case studies and the examples how to actually calculate it in another sessions.